Welcome to the NFP Podcast, where we explore the empowering world of natural family planning. I'm Amy Smith. Join me and my co-host Emily Appledorn each week. Together, we're here to dive deep into the science, the stories, and the spirituality behind NFP. Every week, we push back against the free love culture and advocate for a culture of responsible love, where intentionality and respect are at the forefront of family planning. Join us as we discuss everything from the practicalities of charting and fertility awareness to the profound impact NFP can have on relationships and communities. Whether you're new to NFP or a seasoned pro, our podcast is your go-to resource for honest conversations, expert insights, and real-life experiences. So grab a friend, settle in, and get ready to be inspired. This is the NFP Podcast. After completing his undergraduate degree at McGill University, Dr. Thomas Bouchard spent 3 years doing research on dementia in Parkinson's disease at the University of Alberta. He then completed medical school and residency at the University of Calgary. He now practices general family medicine at West Glen Medical Center and geriatric care at 2 nursing homes. He is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Calgary and enjoys teaching medical students and residents. His special interests include primary care approaches to fertility, menstrual health literacy, and perinatal palliative care. His most recent initiative is developing an online platform for his own patients, Bouchard Medical Home. Alongside his clinical practice, he has started a part-time PhD at the University of British Columbia focused on menstrual cycle monitoring. Please welcome Dr. Thomas Bouchard to the NFP Podcast. All right, guys, welcome back to the podcast. Just me today. Emily is with her little ones, but I'm not alone. I am joined by the Dr. Thomas Bouchard. We're very excited to have him on. Kind of a quick turnaround. They recently released one of his most recent publications on validating ovulation prediction using the Mira monitor, which has been an anticipated study. I know we've talked about Mira. We've already had guests on to talk a lot about the Marquette method, but understanding the Mira monitor and its effectiveness at identifying ovulation in the fertile window, especially I know for a lot of women who use this method during their postpartum time. We're excited to hear the results. So Dr. Bouchard graciously is giving us some of his time to come on and break down the study and give us who are, boots on the ground, really using these methods to achieve our family planning goals, kind of what are the key takeaways that we can get from this, and if whether or not Mira Monitor might be an effective tool for us. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Bouchard.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for being here. So why don't you go ahead? I will say the full title of the article, and I'll link it in the show notes for those of you that want to go check it out yourself. It's Validating Ovulation Prediction and Confirmation with the Mira Monitor, a blinded ultrasound and serum hormone comparison study. So for all of us who don't speak, researchese, maybe you can just take us through the study a little bit, starting with, I'd like to hear how this study idea came about, how your research questions came to be.
Right. So this study, I would say, was inspired by a study done by Herman Berry 25 plus years ago on the Clear Blue monitor. So the Clear Blue monitor was validated using ultrasound and serum hormone comparisons for the purpose of setting the stage for Clear Blue as a gold standard for at-home urine hormone monitoring. And now that Clear Blue has, as you know, low, high, and peak measurements, and there are 4 different monitors on the market right now that look at quantitative, so numerical values for each of the hormones. And Mira monitor is one of those 4. The other 3 would be the Anito monitor, the UVA testing system, and the Prove testing system. So one of those 4 is the Mira monitor. And because we had some users with the Marquette method using it, and there was several factors that went into why we chose the Mira monitor, which we can get into another time. But this was the basis of my PhD. So I'm in the midst of this, and this is the second aim of my PhD, to validate the Mira monitor like Clear Blue was done 25 years ago with ultrasound confirmation of ovulation and the serum hormones as well.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So when the Mira monitor came kind of came up on your radar, or when you thought, okay, well, let's test and see the effectiveness of this monitor, you just kind of went back to, well, how that was done before, and let's run it using this monitor to see if we can measure the effectiveness?
That's right. We started
Okay.
with a study in 2019 in the Marquette method, comparing users who would use Clearblue and Mira side by side. So that was basically looking at comparing the two monitors and whether they could accurately both reflect ovulation. So Mira was highly correlated with what Clearblue was doing. And then the larger study would be this one here, which is using the Mira monitor and having women come in and do follicle tracking ultrasounds until the day of ovulation or the day after, and then doing blood tests a few times in the cycle, and then comparing the urine hormones on the Mira monitor to those blood tests as well. So that was what was done with Clearblue and established it as kind of the benchmark for at-home urine fertility monitors. And now we have that for this quantitative monitor, the Mira monitor.
And so, what was the demographic that you used for this study? The age and, I guess, the cycle pattern of the females that participated in it? Irregular, regular cycles, postpartum, perimenopause, etc.
Yeah, so for this validation study, these were all regularly cycling women. The previous Marquette method studies we've done have looked at postpartum women, perimenopause women. That was the subject of the aim one of my PhD. So that's also published, and you can share that with your listeners. That was looking
Great.
at postpartum and perimenopause transitions. And those were women who used both Clearblue and Mira during the transitions, and we compared those two. So that was published last year. And then this year, it's focused on, like, this is a very intensive study. You can imagine women coming in, doing daily ultrasounds over 3 cycles. That's a lot of work for the participants, and going in for blood tests, doing all the urine hormone monitoring at home over the whole cycle, not just, a few weeks in the cycle. So there's a lot of work that went into this, and I'm super grateful for all the dedicated women who contributed to this study, because it's very helpful to have this robust data set. So we're looking at about 50 women who collected 3 cycles each, usually. And so we're looking at 150 cycles. We found a certain proportion of them, close to 10%, were actually anovulatory follicles, or you may have heard the term luteinized unruptured follicles. So we're going to be able to look at those in the future as well. But for the 121 ovulatory cycles that we analyzed in the study, we have a lot of data for these cycles. We have their bleeding patterns, their exact day of ovulation on ultrasound. We have their serum hormones in a few days of the cycle, and then daily urine hormones. So it gave us this really rich data set that we'll be able to tap into for many years to come. My colleague in France, René Bouchard, did a study in the 90s, and we're still publishing using the data that he collected in the 90s 30 years later. So a type of data set that takes a lot of work to recruit. It took 18 months to recruit all the participants in their cycles for this study. All that work does actually, it's not just this validation paper, but there's a lot of work that we can look into these cycles and see what other dynamics compared to what the findings on ultrasound are showing us, what the serum hormones are showing us. So there's a lot more that can be drawn out of this data set that we collected.
Oh, that's exciting to look forward to future research and what will come from that. For this study in particular, so the women followed a simple routine in that in the morning, like any monitor user would do, they wake up in the morning and the first morning urine, they will pee and they will test that urine for hormone levels. Is that correct?
That's right.
Using the Mira monitor. And then they would, it depending on your schedule for when you would do the blood tests and the ultrasounds, then they would perhaps that same day go in for the blood draw and the ultrasound. And these measurements and these ultrasounds are all being parallel, followed in a parallel fashion. So they can be matched, right? Within a female, here's what her monitor is saying, here's what the um, ultrasound shows, and here's what her blood work shows. So we're kind of stacking those 3 facts on top of each other to get those results. Um,
Exactly.
Okay, great. So from that information, then, what did you guys find that the monitor, how accurate is the monitor when you are comparing what it's saying to the female as far as reading her levels and identifying ovulation or not, with those ultrasounds and the blood work?
Yeah, so the first thing would be the strong association between the LH surge, the LH peak, and the day of ovulation on ultrasound, as well as the progesterone rise, the PDG rise in the urine after the ultrasound confirmed ovulation. So if people look at the figure 4 in the paper that you're referencing, that figure shows you when the LH rise and peak happens relative to the ultrasound day of ovulation, as well as when the progesterone rise happens. And interestingly, there are a small amount of cycles where you actually get ovulation happening on the day that LH goes up. So it might not be the peak day. It might be ovulation was triggered just by the rise in LH. That was enough to trigger the ovary to ovulate. But oftentimes it's the day of the peak or the day after the peak. And that's similar to how Clear Blue also looks at it. You may recall that Clear Blue has 2 peak days. And that's because in that original Berry study from 2000, they showed those 2 peak days are the most likely day of ovulation. So it's important to know that the LH surge is not like a perfect trigger. Like you get a peak and then a few hours later you're going to get ovulation. It's a dynamic process where it could be an LH rise happens and then ovulate. That was enough to trigger ovulation in some women. Other times it might take the LH rise and peak, and then after the peak happens is when ovulation happens. So there's kind of this range that you get over a few days that you could have ovulation, right?
Oh, so interesting. Okay. So, and this is the LH that's picked up on the monitor, or that was picked up from the blood, or
On the
both?
monitor. Yeah.
On the
So we
monitor.
were
Okay.
we were correlating it with the urine hormones to the ultrasound.
Oh,
And
great.
then
Okay.
the very useful thing that's different between Mira and Clear Blue is that it also has progesterone. And
Right.
those other monitors that I mentioned before also measure progesterone too. So what we're getting with these quantitative monitors is prediction of ovulation as well as confirmation of ovulation with that progesterone rise. And that's super helpful because especially in the postpartum period, you can get some rises in LH that don't trigger ovulation. Well, how do you know that? With Clear Blue, you didn't know whether a peak was actually going to give you ovulation, except if you had a menstrual period a few 10 to 14 days later. But in this case, you can see the progesterone rise and then say, I see, this looks like an ovulatory LH surge, not just a random LH surge. That can still happen, right?
So with a Clear Blue monitor, I never used the Clear Blue monitor, and I'm in a postpartum season now. I'm using the Mira monitor. With the Clear Blue monitor, then, based on what you said, that ovulation can be observed as LH is rising, did the Clear Blue monitor, would it identify that day as a peak day the moment it identified LH at all in the metabolites, or is it only a peak? And I'm asking that because I'm thinking, okay, so Monday, my urine test doesn't say peak, but I'm on the rise, and for me that rise can trigger ovulation. So I could potentially be ovulating, but my monitor is telling me this is not a peak day because it only will register the peak day once I hit the surge. Does that my question make
Yeah,
sense?
it does. Yeah. So this is a very important point because the way that peak is determined on Clear Blue is a proprietary algorithm. And if you look into the patents and you look through their studies, you can glean the threshold that they're using for LH that it should pass in order to trigger a peak. But you're not getting those more subtle situations where maybe somebody has a lower LH surge that doesn't reach the peak on Clear Blue. So when people are reporting that they're missing peaks on Clear Blue, this is where a quantitative monitor really comes in handy because they might have a low amplitude LH surge or they might ovulate on an LH rise. So we're getting more of those details in a quantitative monitor that you didn't get with Clear Blue.
I think this is really important for us as users of these methods to understand this because what I'm thinking right now is I don't know if you're familiar with carnival games, but there's a carnival game where you take a big hammer and you hit it as hard as you can and you try to get the little like light to go all the way up to the top and then it dings and that means you're really strong and you achieved the end of the game that you were trying to do. You won it. And I think for me, and I imagine for a lot of other females, we think of the LH surge as like it's got to get to the top before that egg is
Yeah,
going to be released, not knowing
right.
that, oh, wait, no, it doesn't, based on what you're saying, is actually we've seen that just that rise can start to, that the rise of the LH can trigger ovulation, and that rise might not be detected on the simple, you know, qualitative monitor of the clear blue, correct?
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
And so you get a certain amount of probabilities, like as you can have a probabilistic idea of when ovulation will happen based on these different parameters. But without an ultrasound, you can't have a guarantee that you're going to ovulate at a certain time.
Right.
But it does help when you see that progesterone rise, that as the progesterone is rising, then you can say, oh, okay, we are past ovulation. And this is
Right.
where a method like Marquette really shines. And that is that there is what's called the Marquette algorithm, or these parameters around these findings that tell you, okay, how many days should we count after an LH rise to ensure that ovulation is passed, to identify the the luteal infertile period, right? The post peak infertile period. And so the Marquette method has this 3-day count after the likely days of ovulation. So that count, like a 3-day count afterwards, that's not that's not defined by the monitor. That's something you have to add on to your findings. So that's why it's important to note that the Mira monitor on its own doesn't have anything within it that tells you how to avoid pregnancy.
Right.
It's something that you have to overlay on top of these findings, like the Marquette method, to tell you what are my early days, what are my post-peak days, what is that fertile window that I have to count in order to avoid pregnancy. And
Right.
so it's not about a monitor alone approach. It's about a monitor and these probabilities that lend us towards saying, what is the beginning of the fertile window? What is the end of the fertile window?
So with the Marquette, and I know you're not speaking on behalf of the Marquette method per se right now, but with using the Marquette approach with the mirror monitor, then do you think, because we had a really interesting conversation with Louise Boychek. I'm not sure if you know her or not.
Yeah, very
She's
well.
okay, very well. Okay, great. So Louise was on the podcast, and one of the conversations we got into was the approach from the NFP medical professionals towards the attitude, maybe, or just the way that someone might feel towards this demographic of NFP users that achieve a pregnancy when they were not intending to achieve a pregnancy. And that sometimes it it seems for as the on the patient or the user side that from the researcher medical professional side that it's kind of discarded as okay, well, we must have messed up on following the instructions that were designed, and even if we feel confidently that we did not, that we heard the directions and we followed the directions accurately, and yet women are achieving pregnancies when they weren't intending to, even though they were following, again, the method directions well. And we kind of went back and forth with her in a great conversation and talking about specifically the Marquette method and using the Clear Blue monitor. She couldn't speak to obviously the Mirror monitor because this study wasn't published yet at that time, but using something like the monitor to help identify that opening of the fertile window. And also in our instruction to couples, recognizing still what we might not know. And so for couples who have discerned that they have a reason to avoid a pregnancy, should they even be attempting to engage in the marital act during the pre-ovulatory time, or should they just be waiting until they have that progesterone confirmation, that post-ovulatory time? Because if we're still learning things like, oh, well, you don't have to have the LH surge necessarily, you just have to have a start of a rise, and then you could be ovulating, then the method and the use of it might not be as effective in trying to avoid a pregnancy. What do you think?
I think there are several factors at play. One of them is that you can't use a single indicator at any point to define the beginning and end of the fertile window. You're using multiple checks, right? And so the LH surge is one check, right? And so the Marquette method has been used with, say, the pre-mom LH test, and using that as the gauge of when ovulation is happening and providing parameters before and after that to say when the fertile window begins and ends. Clear Blue had estrogen metabolites in the urine and LH in the urine. So that gives you two indicators of hormones. And so that gives you the possibility of having an opening of the fertile window. But there are lots of situations where there's not enough of a lead time. Estrogen seems to not give you a 5-day warning. On average, it does. But in some women, they have a short estrogen rise prior to the LH surge. And so that can be frustrating for some people because they don't seem to get that additional warning. So that's where something like the Marquette method early days algorithm fits in, right? You want to add some more days because your individual estrogen level might not give you the adequate warning to have 5 days before ovulation as a warning for the beginning of the fertile window. I think for me, when I teach couples what parameters to use for their individual case, I always bring up this topic of motivation. So Richard Faring wrote a paper on motivation that is really important to identify when people are highly motivated to avoid pregnancy. That can allow you as an instructor to change how you give them rules about early days, for example. So this study basically showed that an NFP effectiveness goes down when people don't have an 8, 9, or 10 out of 10 motivation. If somebody has 7 or less, the method effectiveness is going to go down. So if that's the case, you tie in people's motivation to how you instruct them in terms of giving them more conservative rules, you know? So for example, early day rules you might not consider in somebody who has a 10 out of 10 motivation to avoid. Maybe those individual cases you say, let's use some post-peak days. And in this case, with using a quantitative monitor, you not only have the LH to trigger your post-peak count, you also have the confirmation with a PDG rise. So you see how adding more indicators in allows you to have more confidence in how you're making decisions about that fertile window.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. So interesting. I have a question about the first morning urine. In the study, it says under the kind of in the abstract when you were talking about the conclusions, this term, and I wanted to understand a little bit more. Strong urine with strong urine serum associations. So that's just saying the strength is the urine serum association, not like the strength of the urine sample. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, good.
In
Go
that
ahead.
understanding, it would be like concentration of the sample. Strong
Okay.
association would be the statistical term.
Okay. Because in the Marquette, was there a certain number of hours before the first urine was collected for it to be considered a good sample? Because if a female
Mm-hmm.
waited, got up 2 hours before and had peed, went back to bed, and then got up again, which one was considered the first urine sample? Did that matter?
Mm-hmm. The main thing is that it's a 4-hour concentrated urine. So
Four
whether
hours.
that was at 6 a.m. or 9 a.m., as long as it's a 4-hour concentrated urine, that's the most important thing.
Okay.
And the first morning urine is really important. And then when we did the urine serum associations, the biggest thing was if you design a study and people are testing their blood later in the day, physiologically, you would not expect that blood to be correlated to the morning urine. And the reason for that is the kidney is a concentrating organ. So it's concentrating hormone values from before the urine was collected. So if you
Mm,
think about it, it'd probably be best to even have the blood collected before the urine. That's just hard to do. If women are
right.
collecting first morning urine, it's hard to get them to go to a blood lab that's not open at 4 a.m., right?
Right.
And so the best associations, understandably and physiologically, came when blood was collected within 90 minutes of that first morning urine. So that's important. It's important to design studies that make sense. And this is the first study that shows we have to consider the timing of blood and urine collections, because
Mm,
if you're just assuming same day, but you're collecting the blood 8 hours after you collected the urine, those are not going to be associated with each other because they're just physiologically different when you think about how hormones change throughout the day.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting. So what did you guys do to mitigate that then?
So if you look at figure 5 and 6 in the study, you'll see that difference over time, that if the serum is collected later in the day, the association goes down. And then
Okay.
we also did an evening urine collection, and the evening urine collection didn't have strong associations with the estrogen and progesterone in the urine, but the FSH and LH did have reasonable or moderate associations. And this comes down to, and we discussed this in the discussion of the paper, it comes down to the diurnal variations or the day-to-day daily variations in these hormone patterns. The acrophase or peak of estrogen in the blood happens in the early hours of the morning to later hours of the morning. So that's why first morning estrogen is the most accurate. Doing estrogen testing in the afternoon, evening is not going to be accurate because that's not when it peaks. Progesterone peaks a little bit later in the morning. So you're going to get a reasonably accurate progesterone value with first morning urine. FSH and LH have more stability during the day, but they do have afternoon peaks. And so that means some women who don't catch a morning LH surge and they have a narrow LH surge over maybe a 12-hour period, they might have one day to the next where they don't actually see the peak of LH in the urine. And so they go and do an afternoon LH test. And so the timing and the variations in the serum peaks of these hormones is really important to help interpret how we're looking at the urine values as well. And this also points to the fact, and this is going to be hard to conceptualize, but just keep in your mind the idea of a peak happening in the LH surge in a narrow window. And say
Mm-hmm.
you're measuring LH in the morning,
Mm-hmm.
you might catch that morning LH at the beginning of the peak or at the end of the peak. And
Right.
so you may not know exactly where you are on the LH peak when you think about it as a continuous variable in the serum. You might be catching one side of the LH peak. And so it looks like it's a low amplitude LH surge, but it's just because you're not testing every hour, every minute of the day. You're just catching it at some point on its rise or fall, right? So all of these things are important to consider and not just have that image in your mind of that carnival LH surge where it's like, oh, finally we hit that peak, we're going to ovulate. Well, we're measuring something that changes every hour of the day, right? So we got to think about those hormone dynamics. And what we presented in this paper is the first opportunity to start that discussion of how does urine reflect what's happening in the serum, and how do we use that to interpret the ovulatory event?
So do you think that if we could more accurately follow the way that the hormones are changing over the course of time, over the course of a cycle, that externally, right? I'm thinking, with people wear the continuous glucose monitor, like if there was a
Yeah,
continuous like fertile monitor and we could
yeah,
watch this,
yeah.
do you think that would kind of be the next tier, right, of something like this, where instead of having to draw blood at a specific time, you could literally wear this and it will continuously monitor the rise and fall of LH, for example.
Yes, yes. And I think people have been talking about that. I think it's a very appropriate next step to get more information. But I think the warning I would have there is that more information doesn't necessarily make it user friendly, right? So the more
Mm,
complex quantitative hormones that we have with Mira make things in some ways more challenging than just low high peak interpretation, right?
right.
So we get more information, we understand the physiology better. That's great. But for the end user using an NFP method, we still have to ask the question, how does the user implement this method? Are they
Right.
having to do complex calculations? Are they having to do this interpretation of the dynamics of the LH surge? And remember, we can't still say that if you reach peak, then you're going to ovulate within 12 hours. That's not the case. You could be ovulating on the rise. You could be ovulating the day after the peak, So there's this probabilistic view of ovulation in relation to the LH surge that we have to think about. That's actually complex to interpret when it comes to continuous monitoring because your physiologic understanding is better, but that doesn't mean your decision making is necessarily improved.
Mm. Oh my gosh, this is so interesting. Okay. I'm gonna resist getting more into the weeds because I would love to do that. And let's try to wrap up just a little bit. I'm gonna link to this study in the show notes again for people that want to go and read more information. Dr. Bouchard, could you maybe give us a little bit of a takeaway? I'm an NFP user. I'm trying to avoid pregnancy. I'm trying to I just identify when I'm ovulating. Is the Mira monitor a viable option for me to do that?
Yes, for sure. And I think
Great.
a lot of my patients are starting to use it and they really like it, but they do need an interpreter. So
Okay.
it's not for the faint of heart. If people are using it, it's good to have a navigator, whether it's a physician, a nurse Marquette teacher, somebody who understands it well, who can help with the decision making, because it's not kind of an out of the box approach that you can use. And a lot of physicians are still uncertain. And even my own patients, they say, oh, I went to a gynecologist and they said they don't believe in the Mira monitor results, right?
Oh,
Well, now we've got this paper that you can share with your physician and say specifically, hey, look at this. This is a study with, several physicians in Canada across different sites who have identified this as now something that is ready for prime time. Like the conclusion of the study is these findings support the clinical adoption of quantitative hormone monitoring for patients attempting to conceive, in our case, also patients wanting to avoid pregnancy. And this can be used in a clinical setting with doctors partnering with their patients to interpret the findings of the menstrual cycle. And those findings are looking at the menstrual cycle as a whole. If you look at figure 7, you can see the whole hormone dynamics across the cycle. This is very valuable information to say, what are the hormones? If you think about the language of the body, what is the language of these hormones, and how can we interpret and read these hormones across the whole cycle? This is going to be very useful for patients using NFP, trying to conceive, and their doctors helping to determine what next steps for investigation.
well, that's so fascinating. So let's wrap up with one final question. As the lead researcher,
that wraps up another episode of the NFP Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you found our discussion enlightening and empowering. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We'd love to hear from you. Please connect with us by sending us an email with your questions and stories to thenfpshow@gmail.com. We'll be back next week with more insights, tips, and heartfelt conversations about natural family planning. Until then, love responsibly.
yeah,
Don't
that
have
was
the
really
video,
cool.
but
Right.
the video that we captured was very beautiful. And the idea of the timing of all of these events happening, hormones, ovulation, blood, and urine, that dynamic was the most interesting to me to uncover.
So neat. Oh my gosh, so neat. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Bouchard. I really appreciate it. I hope our listener found this very helpful. I will link again to this publication. I'll also link again to our episode that we did with Louise Bouchard talking about the Marquette method. So, should you like to learn more about how to actually apply the information your monitor is giving you to your family planning goals, strongly recommend, it sounds like Dr. Bouchard does as well, that you worked with a trained teacher to help you interpret what it is you're reading so that you can achieve whatever your family planning goal may be. So thank you again for your time today, Dr. Bouchard. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
That wraps up another episode of the NFP Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you found our discussion enlightening and empowering. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We'd love to hear from you. Please connect with us by sending us an email with your questions and stories to thenfpshow@gmail.com. We'll be back next week with more insights, tips, and heartfelt conversations about natural family planning. Until then, love responsibly.